In this video, I want to talk about the phrase that came from that landmark Westbury v. Sanders case in 1964 at the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court says that the standard is to create districts that are as equal as is practicable. And again, this word practicable simply means feasible or something that's capable of being accomplished, as opposed to possible, which could be as large as the Constitution would permit and as big as we could get the house. That would be looking at possible, but that's not the standard. There's a standard called practicable, what's feasible. Now, many say that this number of 435 is okay, that it's right, that there's no way we should add more politicians to the mix here, because all that's going to do is create more politicians and we would have greater problems and it would be more expensive. And I'm going to deal with some of the objections that relate to the growth of the house size in a future video. But for the time being, I want to focus on this practicable phase, because what the government would have to prove, as I mentioned in an earlier video, the plaintiffs proved injury, and we put forth several remedies that would dramatically improve the inequity that's in question. So now the burden of proof shifts to the government to justify the inequity, which with some of the numbers we've already talked about, these numbers are 60, 80%. They're not justifiable. They simply aren't. Which is why, incidentally, the government says we don't have to abide by equality because there'd be no way to justify it. But this issue of practicability could say, well, we can't get any larger because the House wouldn't be able to do what it does. It's a deliberative body and we need to keep it a certain size. Well, fine. If Congress and the government really believe that, then because we're dealing with a lawsuit where you need to submit evidence and have that evidence be weighed in court, interestingly, the government has offered not a shred of evidence, any evidence to say that growing to a larger number is a problem and it would create an issue of feasibility or practicability. They simply haven't offered any evidence, no expert witnesses, no documentation, no congressional hearings, none of it. So you can't put forth a naked assertion to say that 435 is the right number, when in fact you would need to analyze this. And I want to share a couple of very interesting things. This number 483, I don't know if you might think why this number is important, what significance it has. Well, guess what? This is the number that in 1920, the United States House of Representatives passed a law, or passed a bill, that requested that the House grow to 483 from 435. So all the way back in 1920, 90 years ago, the House of Representatives at that time thought 483 was fine. But because of an obstructionist Senate, and I could get into some machinations on population shifting, and some of the states would have lost representation and other states would have gained, and going through all that, which I unfortunately don't have time to get into, but the government's brief and our brief do talk about this to some degree. But here back 90 years ago, they didn't think that it was impracticable to grow to a larger house size. And furthermore, we submitted an oral argument that if you look at the House of Commons in England, our mother country, their House of Commons, which is the lower chamber similar to our House, consists of 646 members. And they have 1/5 of the population that the United States does. So if you were to pick any Western democracy that's as close to our own in terms of legal history and sort of logistics and these sorts of things and philosophy, England would be it. And interestingly, if you just add 12 more reps to that number of 646 and get 658, if we were to have a House of 658, it would reduce the level of disparity that I shared in an earlier video. It would reduce the disparity by over 50%. It would cut the disparity by more than half, just growing the House a couple hundred members. Now, in the context of everybody alive today knowing nothing else but 435, sounds strange. Sounds like, oh, that's just way too big. But yet we have a Western democracy that's functioning 1/5 of our population, functioning quite well at a similar size. So again, the government should never be able to get away with nakedly or without any evidence asserting that you can't grow the House any greater. Now here's one other point I want to make before we leave this topic, and that is, how long ago was it that the House was 435 members to start? 100 years ago. Let's think about how different our country was 100 years ago. No jet travel. There was barely phones throughout the Capitol building, which there were phones, but it certainly wasn't as ubiquitous as it is today. No TV, no telecommunication, no internet, no computers. So you have a dramatically different picture, which, by the way, the framers back in the late 1700s and certainly people even in 1910 could not have possibly imagined the level of technological advancement that we have today that would allow for a much larger house to function and be practicable. Because here's the fact of the matter when it comes to the House. Even though it's 435, the House rarely gets together as a whole body to deliberate anything. In fact, the only time they ever get together, really, is when there's a ceremonial vote, either the State of the Union address, which they all get into the Capitol chamber there, which of course they don't debate anything because it's the president talking, or if there's some ceremonial vote like we recently had with healthcare where they all come in. But basically they come in, they vote, and a lot of times they'll just leave. So this idea that 435 is functioning as this uniform, deliberative body is fantasy. It just simply isn't happening. So that can't be an excuse to not grow to a number that creates the equality as near as is practicable. And that is the standard that Westbury laid out for us in 1964, and it's the same standard that we're petitioning the court to ask the government to follow today. So if you want to learn more, please check out our website at apportionment.us. Thank you.